Great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to Barry Supple. Barry, I always start by asking when and where people are born.
Okay. Well, I was born in the then called London Hospital in Whitechapel in 1930, 27th of October 1930. And my parents then lived in Whitechapel.
Well, the next question I would ask is about ancestors. I think in your autobiography you go back to your grandparents, certainly.
Yes.
But some people, like Sir John Gurdon, went back to the Norman Conquest. But go back as far or as little as you like and tell me something about your roots.
Okay. Well, alas, I can't go back any further than grandparents. And in particular, my mother and father's grandfathers. I don't know anything about their mothers' origins. Both sets of grandparents came from Poland, probably perhaps in the late 1890s, the other one certainly in 1905. It was my mother's father, a refugee, as so many people were, from conscription during the Russian-Japanese War. Oddly enough, I know a little bit about their geographic origin because I'm visiting Poland in 2 weeks' time to look for the first time at the two villages which are involved in those. Eastern Poland. They came over with large families, and I'd say many siblings that were young when they came. And the families were very close, so I knew all these siblings and their descendants. So these were pretty large families, 7, 8, 9 siblings in each.
What did they do? What were they doing in Poland?
Well, I don't know about Poland because, like so many young people, I didn't ask the right questions when they were alive enough to give me the answers. My grandparents came over when they were young men. My grandfathers came over when they were young men, and probably in their late teens, so they didn't have much record. They must have worked, but they didn't have much record there. When they came to this country, one of them, my mother's father, actually worked rather casually, first of all, as the census of 1911 described him, a cigarette box manufacturer. He was just a casual labourer. And he subsequently went on to the higher reaches of grocery by pushing a barrow full of bananas in Ridley Road and selling bananas. My father's father, I believe, worked as a tailor, but his sight grew very bad, and I don't believe he worked much in his middle and later years.
They came to East London, didn't they?
They both sets came to East London and Whitechapel. I have the addresses, but I've never tracked down the places. Until my mother's and father's generation, that's where the family were, and then we moved to they moved to the leafy suburbs of Hackney, as they then were, in the late 30s, or middle to late 30s. I don't remember my origins in my first years in Whitechapel, but do remember Dalston, part of Hackney, as it is, from about 1938 on, so when I was 8 or 9. But the whole family moved. My mother's family was much the stronger element in all this. The whole family moved, and we lived with my grandmother and others of my mother's siblings before they were married. But my father and mother got married in 1928 and stayed within that extended family as a place of residence. Indeed, with my father's only sister lived with us as well, so it was a very large household. Very East European, I suppose. Yes.
Were they Jewish?
Yes.
Both on both sides?
Both on both sides were Jewish, yeah.
But any of them sort of pastors or whatever?
No, none of them was either a rabbi or particularly religious, really. Whether they were observant or not, I think rather depends on the definition one has. They were not either observant or particularly learned, but they did observe the 2 or 3 major holidays which social pressure, no doubt, and community momentum obliged them to, the Day of Atonement and the New Year mostly, and Passover. But I don't recall the details because I became very irreligious, but I don't believe that they observed in any great detail. I mean, systematically. It was just a question of attending the synagogue when you ought to, but And I was bar mitzvahed at the age of 13, and marriages took place in synagogues, but you know as much about this or more about this than I do. I mean, it's an anthropological function of a social and community ambience rather than belief. Really.
Well, we'll come further to that later. And your parents, tell me about them.
Yes, my father was a tailor. He was born in 1905. My mother, before she got married, was a seamstress in a furrier. She was in the fur factory. She was born in 1907. They met somehow. Again, I never asked the question. I should have done. Presumably in the East End, and I have one or two very nice photos of them as a young couple, and they got married in 1928. My father stayed the rest of his life as what was then called a journeyman tailor, which was quite interesting to me because he was part of the structure of industry, which again you're familiar with, which was a putting out system almost, small workshops in private houses. My mother ceased to work when she got married, and my father remained a tailor all his life, except for a brief period when he tried to be an entrepreneur and failed in the 50s, well, the late 40s, 50s. But other than that, yes, he was in the tailoring trade, and like so many people of his background and culture. Yeah.
Tell me about their characters and how it may have influenced you. It's a huge subject, but
yeah, no, that's okay. My father was a relaxed and very intelligent person who would have benefited greatly from the education he didn't receive. In fact, he left school at the age of 12 and commuted to work from Reading in the First World War by train every day. But he was always ambitious for learning. He was a fairly strongish character who fostered his two sons. I have a brother, and was sceptical in terms of religion and politics as well. He was quite left-wing. He was an active member of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and that, I suppose, had a slight influence on me, although there were periods when it had a reactionary influence, one reacted against it. But he was a man whom I grew greatly to respect. A little bit more perhaps in retrospect than at the time, but even at the time, the feeling that he was a strong personality whom I admired and who was tolerant of his sons and very kind. My mother was very maternal, a very Jewish mother, although it's said that Jewish fathers make the best Jewish mothers. That's another story. She was a very powerful woman in that sense, taking after her own mother. She was the eldest of 8 children. And like her mother, was sort of held the family together in the sense that she took a lot of decisions, I assume, when I was quite young, and had fairly strong opinions, but she was a loving person and very kind, and perhaps much more demonstrative than my father, who was more, as we used to say in those days, more English, whatever that means. I mean, less patently ethnically Jewish, I suppose. But I suppose you could say they did cosset me. I was the elder of the two, of the firstborn, and in fact I was the only child for 8 years, which I think was probably a pretty powerful influence on the relationship. And they were full of admiration for me, I'm sure, and supported me a lot. So they were rather proud of whatever achievements I managed to attain at school and at university. And on the whole, I don't think I have anything to complain about in terms of my relationship with them, because there was a very substantial degree of toleration on their part, I mean, given the period we were living in. And I suppose in the end I admired my father more than I admired my mother. I admired both, I loved both, but my father was much more of a sort of benchmark of intelligent approach to the world, a keen, perhaps even sceptical view of political atmosphere around us, more encouraging of the studying side of things, more encouraging of reading, of buying me books when I was an early teenager, things of this sort. So on the whole, I think the influences were pretty powerful, and certainly they were benchmarks. But as I grew older, and even now, I still feel that my father is the one I'm sort of want to impress. And I'm sorry he's not around to see what happened, because he died when I was still at the University of Sussex before I came to Cambridge and got the chair that he would no doubt have felt very powerfully about, and then became the master of the college. So at that point I felt sad that he wasn't around, and my mother, I was sad too, but I think that was another sort of more emotional thing. Yeah.
What's your first memory? Not sort of trees waving above your pram memory, but anything very concrete. Do you have a?
Well, I do have one quite early one, which is very powerful. I've often tried to interpret it. It's of my mother falling off a roundabout on holiday somewhere, no doubt Westcliff-on-Sea or Wartime-on-the-Naze is where we went. Wartime-on-the-Naze, and I think the reason it's powerful is that at that time I had very mixed feelings about it. I think she must have done something that I didn't like, or denied me something that I wanted, and because I was both anguished and slightly pleased at what I took to be punishment. So I do have a memory, and I mean I have a memory which was obviously not true, of seeing her flying through the air. She obviously couldn't have thrown through the air, but so I do have that, and I have, for the life of me, can't remember, can't identify when that was, but it would have been before the Second World War, and probably about 1937 or 8, so it's about 7.
You were about 7? Yeah,
it must have been, or perhaps even 6, I can't quite remember. Other than that, there's a haziness, because I also have other memories. I do remember the time when I first learnt that death was inevitable, because an aunt of mine, who was one of the rapscallion siblings of my mother, well, perhaps the only one, informed me of this fact when I was a child. And again, it must have been before the First World War. Well, it would have been the First World War. I must have been perhaps 6 or 7. And I was devastated by it, and my parents were very, very upset at it, and so they berated this aunt, who was called Frances, and we'll hear more about her later perhaps. And that was quite strong, both because of the incident of learning this fact and also of seeing my parents' reaction and their defensiveness about it. So those are two things. I have one or two other family, mostly concerned with this rather riotous family, because all these siblings sort of lived together until quite a late period. And certainly when I was young, we were all in the same house, so there were lots of interactions with different sorts of people. But those are memories. I mean, physical memories I have. Yeah.
Where was your first school?
I went to a school called Sigden Road, which is in Hackney, elementary school, and I suppose there were about 30 or 40 boys in the class. It must have been a boys' club. I've never thought of that, but there was a boys' club. I mean, the school picture I still have is entirely boys. And I do have a memory there of the odour of the no doubt Lifebuoy soap that our middle class teacher, Mr. Griffiths, whose name sticks with me still, must have used, who was very much a middle class person, very impressive in his suit and tie and everything. So I went to Sigden Road Elementary School until wartime came, the evacuation, when I was 9 at just under 9 at the outbreak of war.
And you were evacuated? I
was immediately evacuated with, I don't know, and again I never did ask my parents. I was immediately evacuated with groups, but whether they were the groups from the school or an assembly of people, and I fancy the latter because I went with my 2 young aunts. I had an aunt who is 5 years older than I, and another one who was about 7 years older than I, because of this elongation of the number of siblings that my mother had, she being the eldest. And we were evacuated together, so it couldn't have been the school alone. And I do remember that very pungently. I was evacuated a number of times. The very first time was in the panic at the immediate outbreak of war, when we came to Hockwold, very near here, where many years later I taught a WAA class as a graduate student. Hockwold's a tiny, tiny village in Norfolk. And we weren't there for very long. We came back, and then we were evacuated again in 1940 when the war effort grew very bad. Again with my aunts, and that was for a longer period, because at that point my mother with my then very young brother joined us, and her mother came and an aunt, and we set up home in Witney.
Witney,
Yeah.
Oxford.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, we first of all went to a village called Hayley, but when my mother came, we all rented a house.
Do you remember, this is countryside, isn't it, really?
It is countryside, yes. I discovered bluebells and things of that sort, and fell into a pond and all sorts of...
Were you beginning to have hobbies of any kind? Were you collecting things?
At that stage, I don't believe so. I know that I joined the Sea Cadets as a sort of thing. And
in Witney? No.
In Witney, yes, indeed. In Witney, yes.
The sea is a bit of a distance. But,
I know. Well, I think in those days each of the forces had a sort of young cadet thing, and I joined the Sea Cadets. I think mostly because they had this... it was just a plain blue sweater and a polished brass buckle belt. And in fact, the belt was the only bit of uniform we were issued with, and a hat. But I didn't have... No, I don't recall having hobbies in that sense. I collected chestnuts and things of that sort, and rose hips for syrup and all the things that actively one did, but not hobbies, no.
Do you remember, you're now, what about between 9 and 12, that sort of age, is that right?
Yes. Between 9 and 12, essentially the wartime. Yes, that grows more intense as the years and the memory.
Do you remember any of the teachers at that school? This was at Witney, presumably.
At Witney, no. The only teaching incident I recall, but that was very powerful, was the headmaster, because two of the students were children of the headmaster, and no doubt, in order to show his independence, he caned them once in front of the school for some misdemeanour that I know nothing about, the most extraordinary thing. But I don't remember any of the teachers, but I do remember the same headmaster. My parents told me, saying to them that I ought to prepare myself because there's a chance I might get into Christ's Hospital. But I suspect what he was saying was that I ought to study hard, and that's the sort of thing that could happen. Anyway, but Christ's Hospital sort of loomed as a missed opportunity in those early years. That was in Witney, 1940-41. We then came back to London in 41, and I was evacuated again subsequently when I, quote, won the scholarship, end quote, at the age of 11, and went to King's Lynn, where my school was then evacuated. It was London School, but it was evacuated to King's Lynn.
Was it?
Yes.
So winning the scholarship is 11 plus, is it?
11 plus, yeah.
So
that was in 41. So I went to school in 42. I went to the school in 42, yes.
And this is well-known school?
Well, it was very well known. It was Hackney Downs Grammar School for Boys. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Of course.
Yes. Well, there we are. I joined Harold Pinter and all the others. Right. Yes. And that was then evacuated. Although I didn't meet Harold then, because he wasn't evacuated to King's Lynn. He joined the school. I don't know quite how it happened. When by the time we got back to London in 43. So I was evacuated there, and I have one or two memories of the school. We were billeted on another grammar school, so we joined their classes. And I remember getting into terrible trouble because I argued that Paris was spelled P-A-R-E-E because that's how it was pronounced in French. I shudder to recall this, and I know that I was very obstinate about the spelling. And I was there for a year, and made one or two friends who I've re-established contact with, because Hackney Downs Grammar School for Boys is one of the few state schools that has a website and a good magazine. It's called Cloveline. It's a Clove Club. And I've re-established contact with a number of people throughout. In fact, the next week we're being visited by somebody I was at school with from America. We're all going over to see another friend who was head boy when I was deputy head boy. It's
interesting because your Wikipedia article was clearly written by someone from that school.
Well, yes.
Because it has references to an article in Clove or whatever it is.
Clove Lines, it's called, yes. Oh, that's right, I've seen that, and I wondered how they knew about that. Yes, I don't know who did that. Yeah.
Sort of looking at that whole grammar school period, I mean, a lot of the historians I've interviewed, like Keith Thomas and Of course, Habakkuk and I did an interview, but James Campbell and others all went to grammar schools during that period.
Yeah.
And they seem to have been fantastically good. Simon Schaffer is another example,
Yeah.
and so on. Was that your experience?
Well, it was, because at the time one doesn't appraise it quite in these ways, but certainly it, in retrospect, and to some extent obliquely at the time, it had very high quality, very good masters. And of course, there's an interesting question about why the masters were so good, and that presumably was the lack of alternative avenues for people who were well educated. And they were brilliant. Yeah, 2 or 3 still lives very strongly in my memory.
Can you mention them?
Yes, one was Joe Brearley, who figures very strongly in Harold Pinter's memoirs, because he was an English master who was a theatrical enthusiast and directed Macbeth and then Romeo and Juliet, which were 2 outstanding productions with Harold in the leads. He was very relaxed. He never taught me, but I came into contact with him because of the drama, where I was quite active as well. And he was an exceptional man, because he transcended the ambience and structure of the school to encourage boys. He was intellectual, he was literary, he wanted boys to talk about poetry and drama, and he took us to interesting plays. He just was an activist. At another level, there was a man called Kenneth Hooton, who was a historian, who enthused me with the love for economic history, as it was. Even then, because it was one of the few schools which offered economic history rather than straight history at A level. And he was an influence in a slightly different way, much more scholarly, much more direct, much more cynical in his way, but powerful. And there was a fine and curious man called Percy Coffin, who was a geographer who retooled himself as an economist in order to teach us economics, because there wasn't an economist in the school. He was very nice. And there was a sadist called G, who was a biology teacher who.
Pinning him down somewhat.
No, he wasn't sadist in that formal sense, but he bullied boys.
Oh,
that's
right.
what I mean, didn't it?
Good.
And, but it was a rich tapestry. There were lots of others masters that I could talk about.
You mentioned drama, which you were active in.
Yeah.
Tell me about the sort of extracurricular activities, and drama was one of them.
Drama and sport, I suppose, were the 2 principal ones in my parents' school. I was very, very athletic. Very committed to athletic activities in all seasons. So I ran, and I played cricket, and I played soccer for the team, for the school team. In fact, I played soccer at for the first team at a very early age, because I was a goalkeeper. And drama was the other important one, although I think it must only have materialised with this production Macbeth, which was in 1947, so I was 16, and really produced it, and it was a wonderful production in its way. We all dressed in Army Cadet Corps uniforms, because I belonged to the Cadet Corps, and Harold Pinter was Macbeth, and I was Malcolm, the young king. And I remember really saying to me, I was still learning this trade, because Malcolm at some point, when told of it that his father's been murdered, has to say, "Oh, by whom?" in a sort of shrieking way. And I rather conversationally said, "Oh, by whom?" and really nicely mocked me as saying, "This is not a dinner party discussion." And Harold was a very strong Macbeth. And then the next year was this extraordinary production of Romeo and Juliet, which must have been one of the most, not because I was in it, because the way Harold did it and what it was done must have been one of the most extraordinary.
When you say Harold did it, he was a producer?
He was Romeo.
Oh, really?
He was Romeo. He lifted it. It was, really was the director. And I haven't seen all that many school productions, but I doubt if many were better, more full of impact than that, I should say. So Harold Pinter was Romeo, I was Mercutio, and the man, Henry Grimberg, who played Tybalt, whom I kill, of course, is the one who's coming over next week from New York to have dinner with us and stay with us and go and see somebody else. So those are the 2. The last year, 48 was my lower sixth. The last year, Harold and I wanted to do Hamlet for obvious reasons. He wanted to be Hamlet. And really refused. I mean, he said it wasn't appropriate, it wasn't the timing, wasn't right, it wasn't good. And Harold and I concocted a scheme which didn't come to fruition to do it privately, to do it independently. We were going to put on a production of Hamlet as schoolboys, nothing happened. And the novel I Will Never Write is about the middle-aged men in their 50s and 60s who come together finally to do it after 40 years.
It would be rather sweet and maybe done in a Pinteresque way.
Yes, yes. Anyway, so that's those.
But, I mean, you've written about quite a lot, well, a certain amount about Harold and so on. But perhaps just for the visual record, what was he like at that age?
He was very precocious, and had a sort of pulling power on the rest of us because of this. He was precocious both in his person, his personal relationships with girls, for example, but also in his literary interests. He, in a sense, stimulated us to get concerned not only with conventional people like George Bernard Shaw, but Henry Miller and all this sort of thing. And he wrote a lot, and he was a very strong personality and very likable. He and I were great friends. And in fact, it was because we were great friends that our fathers became partners in a little tailoring business, which was the unsuccessful entrepreneurial venture I mentioned earlier. Harold had a strong temper. I remember once, to my eternal shame, claiming in the course of a hot argument that the reason he liked D.H. Lawrence was because of the dirty bits, and he almost fell me to the ground because of this silly comment. That we went on holiday together. We had a fine holiday once, as I suppose we were 16 or 17, in France, hitchhiking, where I almost persuaded him to take an interest in politics, but he was resistant to that. He did once join the Army Cadet Corps, no doubt with me, and could never swing the right arm with the correct leg as he was marching, so he didn't stay very long. Which was ironic, because later on he was a conscientious objector, but he did. But he was a good close friend, and I knew his parents very well because we lived near each other. And the aunt I referred to earlier, who told me about the existence of death, I think, Francis, at one point, he subsequently confessed to me many years later he had an affair with her. But earlier on, when my grandmother was killed by a bus, knocked over by a bus, in probably about 1947, it was 1947, and I couldn't therefore play in the school team the next day. And the only way of communicating, and before emails or telephones, was to put a note through his door. And he told me subsequently that this note had come through his door saying when grandmother was the basis for one of his early short stories, which he never published, but he wrote it up. And the other thing about him was that he was flamboyantly egocentric. The story I tell in the autobiography is going with him one day to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, and to my embarrassment, his standing on a box and saying to the assembled crowd, "I'd like to read some poems by a very gifted and up-and-coming poet called Harold Pinter," and then reading some of his own poems, which is very
British, is it?
Yes. So, and he was a good sportsman as well, very strong, very powerful, and very active.
And you remained friends after school or not?
Well, we sort of did. What happened was that he left early and went to RADA. I went to college and didn't know much, but then when I got up here as at Cambridge as a graduate student, he was doing quite well as an actor, and I wrote to him, and we re-established a bit of contact, but not very much. And I didn't see him again properly until many years later, in 1958. I came back from America for a brief visit and went to see him and his then wife and child, and we sort of intermittently over the years did, but not very much. We re-established one contact many years later, perhaps we'll come to that, when I took exception to something that one of his biographers had written about me in his biography, quoting him wrongly, quoting Harold wrongly. But I mean, quoting Harold perhaps correctly, accurately, but wrongly.
You mentioned you tried to persuade him to be interested in politics. Were you interested in politics at this age?
Was I? Yeah, yes, I was. I think in a sort of schoolboyish intellectual way of being interested in reading Marxist literature or Plekhanov and things of this sort, and Lenin. I think, I was going to say partly through my father, that's not quite true, because I remember being slightly embarrassed when my father discovered that I was reading one of Plekhanov's things and thinking that I wanted to establish a bit of arm's length between me and his interests. But yes, I was sort of interested, not actively, I wasn't an activist in politics, but I was certainly left-wing and interested in the intellectual roots of that. Yeah. Yeah.
And you mentioned you were bar mitzvahed. What age was that?
13.
13. So just to return to the theme of religion, sure. You very quickly said that you moved right away from this, but religion, for many people, whether you love it or especially if you hate it, like Dawkins, you spend your whole life involved with it.
Yes.
What has your position shaped, or how has it shaped over your life?
Well, I think there's an ambiguity which is, I was going to say, distinctive to Jews, but probably Muslims feel the same, which is the pull between one's reaction to the belief, which can often, as in my case, be very sceptical and rejectionist, on the one hand, and the community social ambience, the sort of ethnic element, which is pretty powerful. So that I quite early on, encouraged by my father, who once influenced me greatly by saying the Pope can't possibly believe all that, he's much too intelligent. Possibly influenced by my father, I was sceptical from a very early age, but never would have dreamt of not being bar mitzvahed, because that was what you did, and that's what happened in that circle. And the only Hebrew I ever learned was in order to read the section of the law that was relevant to the timing of the ceremony and I never went to synagogue again, and I walked out of my brother's bar mitzvah because I had a soccer match that needed attending to. So over the years, I've never dissociated myself from the Jewish background, but never felt that I wanted to be identified as a religious. Well, I'm not a religious or Orthodox Jew, so I certainly haven't. The only times I've been back to a synagogue is when people got married and I wanted to attend the ceremony, and that's rare now. And certainly I was insistent, well, I didn't have to insist very strongly, that my own boys were not bar mitzvahed. I simply ignored it.
I was... well, there are two questions fighting in my mind. One was Supple, the name Supple. Has the name changed?
Yes, it was when they came in, no doubt because of some immigration officer, they were called Supple. No, not because, I know for certain it's not because of that. They were called Supple, S-O-P-E-L.
Yeah.
And the reason I know that is that I have done a bit of delving into the digital archives of the village from which they came, which is called Supple near Białystok in northeastern Poland. And there were Supples there.
I see.
And not only that, but I know they were the same Supples because my father always used to tell me that all his uncles and his own father came, except one uncle who stayed in Poland and was killed in the Holocaust. And sure enough, in the Yad Vashem archive, Yad Vashem is the archive of the Holocaust, there is a Supple in Sukovola who has his name, and who had two sons who were both killed then. So that was, but the name was corrupted very early on by common usage into Supple. And my mother, I should have said of my father that one of his traits, which I've inherited strongly, is an excessive respect for bureaucracy. And for administrative regulations.
This led you on to the lever human.
That's right. But the fact of that is that he registered me at birth as Supple, even though he was already called Supple. And my mother she told me later, was outraged at this. She said it will give me an awful lot of trouble in future. He's known as Supple, but you put Supple on his birth certificate because my father felt he ought to conform. And sure enough, years later, I had to go to a notary public and certify that my name was Supple by common usage and mark document A, document B. But curiously, even the American immigration authorities accepted that. I always thought that they would throw me out immediately as a Russian spy, but they didn't.
Well, they would now, but they didn't then.
Yeah.
The other question to do with religion is that I've interviewed quite a lot of masters of colleges, most of whom are agnostic or atheists, and I always ask them how they feel when they're presiding in chapel as masters of the college, and how they square that with their religious disbelief. Was it a problem for you at all?
It wasn't a great problem. I used to go to evensong from time to time, quite often, which I suppose I rationalised on two grounds. One is that I could hear the preacher talk and he or she wasn't necessarily religious anyway. And the other one was that it gave me a contemplative moment away from the stress and strife of college things. But I thought of it as a collegiate ritual. I mean, actually pronouncing, admitting fellows is a much more explicit form of that. And I took it as a bit of ritual. I usually was very averse to ritual, but I took it as a bit of ritual that was, it came with the rations. It was part of one's obligation,
Well, why was it explicitly Christian? Because you do it in the chapel. You use Latin words, but you don't use the words Christ or Jesus. Or
you do in the missions catechism. Yeah, you do at Cats, but you can. There was a way of avoiding using the word Christ, which I did, which I did for Jewish fellows, but not for fellows who I assume are Christian. Yeah, but it is more explicit in the. I was going to say catechism, that's probably the wrong word, but in the phraseology at St Catherine's, the admission,
Right, well, let's go on to the movement from that school, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about there, to university.
Yeah.
You went to the LSE?
I went to LSE. By one of the pleasant ironies of life, I got a Leave of Hume scholarship. And was interviewed at LSE very nicely. Coincidentally, I happened to be reading The Horse's Mouth by Joyce Carey. It was one of the few novels I'd reading. And when they asked me what I was reading, I said that, and that greatly impressed my interviewers, including T.S. Ashton, the historian who was chairing that. And so I went there. I was also interviewed at University College London, but they magnanimously said, well, we see you've been interviewed by LSE. So since I wanted to read economics, they didn't think it was competition. So I went to LSE, in 1949, and was there for 3 years. Very happily. I suppose in retrospect it would have been more interesting to have been at a non-residential, because I lived at home, a non-residential university, and then gone as a graduate student to London. I mean, I did a research student, so I did it the other way around. So there were degrees of inconvenience, but it was very pleasant, and I was quite active in LSE, both academically, where I did quite well, and very much influenced by Jack Fisher.
I was going to say, yes. Ask about him.
Very much so, yes. Well, at that age, one is very impressed by the sort of relaxed cynicism of somebody like Jack, and his perception and the cutting edge of his mind. I mean, this sort of combination is pretty powerful. And I did his special subject, so I was quite close to him.
16th century economic.
Yes, 16th century, yes, so that was very, very good. And then also, he didn't temper the wind to the law of Sean Lamb. When I composed a proposal for research to come up to Cambridge, his one comment was, you read a lot of Ernest Hemingway, don't you? So very Jackish. But he was a very strong influence on my
Was he a good lecturer?
Pardon?
Did you go to his lecture?
Yes, I did. He
was a good lecturer?
He was a good lecturer, a humorous lecturer, and good. I suppose better for good students than for students who wanted to get their head down and get all the data. I mean, in a different way, rather like Lance Beals, who used to lecture and nobody could take notes because we didn't know what he was saying. But Jack Fisher was a very good lecturer. He was probably a much better small group teacher for the reasons that I've implied. So the seminars, he was really excellent and brought people out, and was really quite good. Ashton, I suppose, was the most straightforward, good lecturer because he had everything well organised. Yeah. So LSE was a very happy time, and I was very active in LSE sports as well. And also I took a role in the student union as a grants officer, writing irate and useless letters to local authorities, student grants.
Well, I talked to Jack Fisher about Tawny, who he knew a bit, and you mentioned you'd met him.
Yes. Well, I met him later. He was retired by the time I got to LSE. Although I went to his lectures, he gave a series of lectures on Lionel Cranfield, which was very close because I've always wanted to see the book of records he was going to produce and never did produce. But when I was a research student, I thought I really ought to see him because I worked on the 1600-1640 period, which is exactly the one he was concerned with Cranfield. And he entertained me to tea in his flat in Mecklenburg Square. But I was disappointed. I mean, he was a lovely man, but he wasn't really very interested in what I was doing or in being forthcoming. But that I don't know what age he would have been at that time. So this would have been 1953-4, something like that. So
quite old.
He was quite old. Yes, I mean he was very charming and nice, but
disorganised. I mean,
very disorganised. Yeah.
The impression is
yes, and the herbal tobacco rather.
Yes, and sort of fried eggs in among the.
Yes, that's right. His wife was even more disorganised. She came in late to his lectures when he lectured on Cranfield. I was struck also with the fact that the sense that when Tawney lectured in this beautifully modulated prose, I believe he had it committed to memory. I mean, I am sure that because there was one point at which he was interrupted by his wife coming in late and disorganised, and he went back 3 sentences, and they were exactly the same sentences that he'd done before. Yeah, but he was he was a sort of hero, as you said of yours, and he's bound to be. I mean, he was a man without very obvious faults, except I think Jack Fisher was rather cynical about Tawney.
Was he?
Yeah, a friend of mine once said, if Jack ever walked by one of the Puritans being burnt at the stake, he would take his pipe out of his mouth and say, "Oh, it's a pity," and walk on.
I mean, Jack was, a hero of mine as well, to a certain extent. Several of his famous articles, but he was one of those pre-RAE style academics who, in his life, produced 4 or 5 really very, very important articles, but I don't think he produced many magnum
Not at all, no, absolutely not, no. And it was said, no doubt you've heard it, that some of the most influential unwritten books of the 20th century are on Jack Fisher's desk. Oh no, it was he who was producing the Cranfield thing, that was it, yes, and it never came out. And I think his influence lived on through these 3 or 4 seminal articles and through the people he influenced. There were many. I used to see him in later years when I came back to England and was at Sussex I suppose now in the 80s, when other devotees entertained him to lunch once every few months, and I used to come up to London and meet him, and he suffered very badly from arthritis but utterly refused to acknowledge it or alter his behaviour for this terrible pain he was under when he walked. But we had, and he was his usual sparkling self. And he did attract a lot of devotion from some people more than I, because they stayed with him in their graduate years, and I had moved on to Cambridge. And his daughter wrote to me when they heard about the autobiography, and I sent her my mother copies.
Were there any other, LSE, when I was there for a short time, there were some always very good people in other departments in philosophy, like Ernest Gellner or wherever it was, or David Glass in demography. I went to his lectures, or Keith Hopkins in sociology and so on. Were there other people in other disciplines who inspired you at the LSE? Well, very brief.
The first and strongest, and very briefly, was Karl Popper. I went to Popper's the lecture as a first-year student, and was so profoundly impressed that I was tempted to change subject from. I was then an economist. I changed from economic history to philosophy, and went up to him after one of his lectures. It's the only conversation I ever had with him, to try to arrange a meeting so that we could talk about this. And he was very busy. I mean, to do him justice, I would have been just as busy perhaps in later years, and didn't brush me off. But it wasn't the response that I was somehow dependently looking for, and that turned me off completely. I shouldn't have done, because the reasons I was thinking of it were much more deeper than that. But they did relate to the way he was lecturing and what he was writing about. So that was an initial influence, and I did go on to read Open Society and so forth. There in economics. There was a lovely Phelps Brown, whom I met in later years when I went to Oxford, who was not so much an influence as a man whose lectures were attractive, and I went to, and also for a quite different reason, the formidable Arnold Plant. You may not have come across Arnold Plant, who was a real reactionary, I mean, in the best sense of the word, a very conservative economist who stimulated us a lot. Oh yes, and the other one was Harold Lasky, but of course everybody says that, but it was Harold Lasky, yeah.
He was still around. I mean,
yes, he died in my second year, or the end of my first year. And although I hadn't thought of it like that, when he did die, I felt somewhat bereft, because the feeling I had was somebody who died to whom I could have gone in trouble or for advice or whatever, if I needed to, and he wasn't there. And he was I learned later that he was in fact very good with students and helped graduate students and overseas students who were at LSE. And in many years later, when I met my then wife and got married, she confessed that she'd been at LSE at an earlier stage and had gone to see him for advice about where to go and so forth. So he was an influence, yeah. Well, not an influence, he was a sort of a model, really. In economic theory, not very much. I mean, I did have a little run-in with Lionel Robbins, because I studied what were then called the BSc and the new regulations, now the ancient regulations, which changed life. And he rather progressively organised a meeting with the students to see what they felt, which in 1950 was. And I did have the temerity to say something. I forget what it was, and he slapped me down, and I forget how. But not very much. Yeah. But I shifted. The man I did become friendly with was Alan Peacock, who was an economist, who was to whom I went to say that I was going to change from economics to economic history, and I, over the years, kept in touch with him.
So you came to Hemingway Land, or I'm not quite sure what the joke about.
It's the style. I mean, he thought that the way I'd written it was too much like Hemingway's.
I thought it was some allusion to the old man.
No. It's just that he was looking at the short sentences. Yeah.
So you came to Cambridge.
I came to Cambridge, yeah.
Why did you come here? I mean, there were some economic historians here who.
I can't entirely remember. There was a so-called open scholarship. I had scholarship open to people who were not from Cambridge at Christ's. And I suppose the thought of winning a scholarship and getting some financial base was there, although you could get grants anyway, to get a change. And because Cambridge, yes, was a sort of home of economic history, a home of economic history, and Munya Poston was here, and Charles Wilson and others. So I put in for the scholarship and research student scholarship, and was awarded it at Christ, to my father's ill-concealed delight, and established contact almost immediately with Jack Plum, who was then a graduate tutor. Yeah.
We will have a Plum story or two. I mean, did you? He was quite a lively character, shall we put it?
Oh yes.
You got on though with.
I got on with him very well. He was very kind, as he can be. I mean, he was a man who had many parts to him, and I fell on the right side of one of the parts, and that was all right. So he cosseted me. I think with Jack Plum, his own origins as a grammar school boy coming into the slightly alien atmosphere of Cambridge made him very sympathetic to people, not only from his own grammar school background. There were people like Neil McKendrick, but to people like me. So he sort of wanted to bring me on. So he did invite me to little tea parties to meet other fellows, and went out his way and encouraged me to see him. And in fact, I can't really give credence to my temerity. There was a time when I got rather unhappy, and I felt lonely, and it was different from LSE, and I was away from home. And Cambridge, except for the bell ringing on Wednesdays, didn't seem very much like the sort of sentimental thing that it was held up to be. So I went to see him. I just went to confess this. I can't believe that I would have done, because of the normal course, let's see what I'm about. But he was very good. Just talked about things. So he was there. I mean, he didn't teach me anything, of course, but he gave me supervisees. He organised teaching for me right from the beginning. So I taught at the very early stage, which was a strange experience, because I certainly never lectured, and I hadn't tried. So I got to know quite well in the environs of Christ. My actual supervisor was Charles Wilson of Jesus, who was equally nice, but in a quite different way. He wanted to do nothing but talk about the bursarship of Jesus, which he was then bursting. Yes. So, but Jack Plum, over the years, of course, I was very close to up and down. And then when I came back to Cambridge after many years away, I think he bullied the Fellowship of Christ into electing me, not because they didn't want to, but because he had a spurious theory, which was that anybody who'd been a member of a college was entitled to get a professorial fellowship. They denied this, but it's too late. And so I got to know quite well his master. Yeah.
And the sort of part of the well-known generation of his pupils were really the next generation on from you, weren't they? I mean, Quentin Skinner and
that's right,
Roy Porter and
and Simon Sharma, and Neil McKendrick as well.
They were all about 10 years.
Yes, they were a bit down the line. Yeah. In fact, there weren't many. There was a man called Maurice Cogan, whom you wouldn't have heard of, who went on to the civil service and did very well in the Department of Education. Chose the wrong department. It was the Department of Education. He did well in the backwater, sort of thing. But, and Jack was very proud of him. But it was the later generation. And people, I met them all on Jack's 80th birthday, because they had a big party, dinner for him in Christ, and I was one of the speakers. And, typical of Jack, he was very pleased with what I said and rewarded me by offering me the opportunity of giving lunch to Princess Margaret.
That's the highest accolade you could have.
I thought of that at the time, which I did, yes. But I had a soft and hateful feeling for Jack. I mean, he could be a hateful man, but he was also a lovely man. So.
And the other, his great opponent, of course, was Geoffrey Elton. Did you come across him at all?
I only came across Geoffrey Elton when I came back as to the chair of economic history on the faculty. But he was the same Geoffrey Elton, and I did have. There were a number of occasions, but I had the one occasion when I had to say, Geoffrey, the reason I'm opposing you is I think you're wrong. He's very adamant about things, but he was without. I think, like some others, he was without conscience when it came to supporting his own students. And when one of his graduate students was the performance as a PhD was questioned, he wanted to change the whole rules for this and things like that. But he was getting on by then. We're talking then about 82, 3, something like that. But he I met, and I also met Eric Hosborne here.
Yes.
Yeah, when I was a graduate student. Yeah. And in fact, Eric Hosborne asked me where I'd come from, and I said the school, rather pompously, and he quite rightly said, "Which school was that?" Meaning the London School of Economics.
I see. Yes. I've interviewed him. He hasn't, and he went through the grammar school system, which I was writing. And, was he teaching in Cambridge when you met him, or was he just a?
I think he was the Ehrman Fellow here, which was this sort of 5-year fellowship that Jack once urged me to, which I didn't get, but I'll tell you about that later. And Jack said, "You must go in for it because a fellow of kings has never starved." But I think Eric was then the Ehrman Fellow. And was having constant tussles with Peter Laslett. I once went to a little debate they had together.
What was your PhD on?
Well, it was very much a derivative from Jack Fisher. It was on commercial crisis and change. It was called 1600, 1640, on trade fluctuations. Yeah, it was the book. Yeah, it was the book. And I chose it. Initially, I'd chosen a whole 100 years, middle of the 16th, the middle of the 17th century. But it was soon obvious that it was much a bigger a bite, so I halved it. So it was a sort of continuation of the interest that Jack had had, and no doubt he was capable of writing it at the drop of a hat, but he didn't, because he hadn't written these things. He had followed on from. He'd written something on fluctuations of the wool trade in the late 16th century, and so so it was with his advice, I suppose, and that was the thesis. For which I had to spend a fair amount of time in London in the public record office, as it then was, which was the point at which I said to myself, well, have I done it the right way around? Would I have had a better time athletically and intellectually as an undergraduate at Cambridge? And then but it didn't make much difference. So I took, I think, certainly one, perhaps 2 terms in London, but a lot of time here because the calendar of state papers was quite good for me, things like that. And Charles Wilson gave me a lot of free rein because he didn't know much about it.
Was he interested at all? Or was he...
Oh yes, he was quite interested and encouraging, and used to read things, and I would go to see him, and he came to the seminar paper I gave in it to Munya Poston's seminar, and he appropriated some of it to publish himself at some later stage. That's the name of the game. And he was very good in particular. Charles was very good in particular when at some stage I stumbled across in the public record office some papers relating to Thomas Munn. I don't know if you've come across Thomas Munn, the 17th century economist, who really discovered the balance of payments. But nobody quite knew, and he published a book on it, a pamphlet on it in the late. It was published posthumously, and it was called England's Treasure by Foreign Trade. And I discovered the submission he made to a commission of inquiry in 1621, which had it all there. And just as I was about to publish it, some other so-and-so found it and published it. And I went in some distress to Wilson, but Wilson was very good. He said, things would. It's all right. Other things will happen, and this isn't the end of the world. You'll publish something. You can do this as well, and I did publish it as well. And he was very philosophic, in the same way that Jack Plum was in later years, when I failed to be elected to the Mastership of Christ, and he said, "Doors open, Barry. Doors open. Don't worry." And that's what I called my autobiography.
Yes, open. I remember that. Yes. The other figure, we've only got 2 or 3 minutes, but if you're talking about Tawney and the run up to the Civil War, the other figure of that time that springs to many people's minds is Hugh Trevor Roper.
Yes.
Did you come across Hugh?
I didn't when I was a graduate student. I did in later years twice. Once when he came to Sussex in its early days to give lectures on Christian Europe, or I forget what it was called. And there was a great tizzy about that. And then when I was master of St Catherine's, and he became master of Peterhouse. But I only knew him in that sense socially, not academically. Lawrence Stone I knew a bit, again in later years, because I edited, I forget what it was, I edited for for one of the journals of his. But I wasn't close to them. Really.